Hey folks, thanks for tuning in to episode 5. Today we're going to be talking about the term anti-vaxxer or anti-vaxxers. This is part of a bigotry series that I'll be doing where I address other terms similar to this one that are subject to bigotry. In this video, we will be discussing the divisive nature of the term anti-vaxxer, the negative impact bigotry has on the topic of vaccines, the value of being your own health advocate, and the need for transparency, integrity, and high-quality, unbiased research within the industry. This video will not be discussing pro or anti-vaccine agendas, autism, or any other developmental disorder. So let's first define anti-vaxxer. A quick Google search yielded Merriam-Webster's definition as a person who opposes vaccination or laws that mandate vaccination. According to Google, an anti-vaxxer is a person who is opposed to vaccination, typically a parent who does not wish to vaccinate their child. I found it interesting that this definition included who is typically an anti-vaxxer. So if there are anti-vaxxers, there must be pro-vaxxers, and this creates a divide. A true anti-vaxxer are those who are opposed to all vaccines of all kinds in any capacity and oppose any law that mandates vaccination. On the other end of the spectrum, you have your pro-vaxxers, and a true pro-vaxxer is anyone who supports all vaccines of all kinds in all capacities and supports legislation that mandates vaccination. Don't feel like you fit one of those descriptions? Yeah, a lot of people don't, and that's why the term anti-vaxxer can be harmful. A quick Google search of anti-vaxxer memes shows that the term anti-vaxxer is being used to mean stupid, moronic, anti-science, a bad parent, or even putting other people's lives at risk. So let's take a closer look at what could be in the void between anti-vaxxer and pro-vaxxer. First of all, people could take issue with any one of the 51 plus vaccines recommended from birth to 18 by the CDC. People could also take issue with the CDC's vaccine schedule itself. It's worth noting that other countries have different vaccine schedules from the United States. People could look at the rates or prevalence of various diseases and the risk of harm or death related to those specific diseases. People could look at the risk of harm or death from individual vaccines themselves, or the idea of the risk or harm that multiple vaccines at one time may or may not pose. And finally, some people may just have issues with conflicts of interest that may exist between various parties related to vaccinations. To highlight some of the issues within this void, I'd like to use tetanus as an example. According to the CDC, from 2001 to 2008, there were 26 deaths from the tetanus virus. 20 of those deaths were people 65 years or older. No deaths were of people 35 years of age or younger. And tetanus is a non-communicable disease, meaning that it's not contagious and cannot be passed from one person to another. According to VAERS, which is the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System, from 2005 to 2019, there were a total of 395 reported deaths from receiving the tetanus vaccine. It's important to note that these are reported deaths, not actual deaths. But nonetheless, this is the number that was reported to the CDC from 2005 to 2019. Therefore, these seem like some fair questions that someone might have about tetanus or the tetanus vaccine. Is it essential for children to get this vaccine if they are not a high-risk population and it is a non-communicable disease? How many people are being put at risk of adverse events like seizures or even death by receiving the vaccine itself? And finally, is someone labeled an anti-vaxxer for asking questions like these? While we're on the topic of injury from vaccines, it's worth noting that there is a government-funded program that was created to compensate people who may have been injured by certain vaccines. The VAERS database, which I mentioned earlier, received over 6,000 petitions from 2006 to 2017. Of those, more than 4,000 were compensated. Since the program began in 1988, it has paid out over $4.1 billion in compensation. Vaccines are not a black and white issue. Terms like anti-vaxxer promote intolerance towards those with varying opinions, It silences productive conversations that address the complexity of the issue and stigmatizes those that have questions and concerns. I've broken down why people have questions and concerns into 4 main categories, although there is crossover between. Those categories are quality of research, governmental transparency, big pharmaceuticals, their integrity and their bias, and personal experience and accidents. According to the National Institute of Health, observational studies are a key part of the evidence base for vaccine effectiveness, yet these study designs suffer from risk of bias. A systematic review of the influenza virus done by the Cochrane Institute included this warning at the bottom. This review includes 15 out of 36 trials funded by the industry. An earlier systematic review of 274 influenza vaccine studies published up to 2007 found industry-funded studies were published in more prestigious journals and cited more than other studies independently from methodological quality and size. Studies funded from public sources were significantly less likely to report conclusions favorable to the vaccines. The review showed that reliable evidence on influenza vaccines is thin, but there is evidence of widespread manipulation of conclusions and spurious notoriety of the studies. According to Transparency International, pharmaceuticals stand out as a subsector that is particularly prone to corruption. There are abundant examples globally that display how corruption in the pharmaceutical sector endangers positive health outcomes. Paxil clinical trial data serves as a specific example of corruption within the pharmaceutical industry. GlaxoSmithKline prepared, published, and distributed a misleading journal article that misreported a clinical trial. At the same time, the company did not make available data from 2 other studies in which Paxil failed to demonstrate efficacy. The company pleaded guilty and paid $3 billion, the largest healthcare fraud settlement in U.S. history. The original clinical trial data was reanalyzed in 2015, showing that the drug was not only ineffective for treating depression, but potentially unsafe, as it increased the prevalence of suicidal thoughts and behavior. I'm going to go through these next few things quickly, but I highly recommend that you come back, pause the video, follow the links, and do your own research. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to touch on them briefly. These next few items relate to why people might have concerns about governmental transparency. The government-funded Tuskegee syphilis study involving 600 black men took place from 1932 to 1972 without public knowledge or informed consent. Thalidomide prescribed in the 1950s caused 10,000 babies to be born with birth defects. From 2015 to 2019, the FDA has recalled 209 drugs. Doctors were originally told in medical school that opiate-based pain medications were safe and would not be addictive. Now, 46 people fatally overdose on prescription drugs every day. In 1976, concerns about a possible influenza pandemic involving a virus similar to the deadly 1918 pandemic strain, later to be called swine flu, resulted in a large-scale vaccination program for the entire country. 45 million people were vaccinated in 10 weeks. The U.S. government abruptly stopped the vaccination program when no swine flu cases were detected. Unexpected high rates of Guillain-Barré syndrome were reported in vaccinated individuals. This resulted in 53 deaths. We also have the Cutter incident in 1955, one of the worst pharmaceutical disasters in U.S. history according to the New England Journal of Medicine. There was a flaw in the manufacturing process resulting in a live polio virus. There were 40,000 cases of polio, 51 cases of permanent paralysis, and 5 deaths among those vaccinated. There were 113 cases of paralysis and 5 deaths amongst those who came in contact with those vaccinated individuals. We can also consider any person having experienced an adverse reaction, either personally or to a loved one. I want to emphasize that I'm not trying to make an argument for or against vaccines. I'm only trying to highlight that all of these issues influence the conversations and the attitudes related to vaccines. Let's take a second to look at how big of a problem some of these diseases were, how big of a problem some of these diseases are, and how they stack up against some other modern-day health concerns. Here we have some of the average annual death rates of these diseases before their vaccines were implemented. 1,879 polio deaths were reported each year from 1951 to 1954. 1,528 smallpox deaths were reported each year in the United States from 1900 to 1904. 432 measles-associated deaths were reported each year from 1958 to 1962. 103 varicella or chickenpox deaths were reported each year from 1990 to 1996. So let's take a closer look at measles. In the first decade of reporting, 1912, an average of 6,000 measles-related deaths were reported each year. In the decade before 1963, when the vaccine became available, it's estimated that nearly all children got measles by the time they were 15 years old. From 1912 to 1962, pre-vaccine, average deaths per year decreased from 6,000 to 432. This is significant because it shows a part of the conversation that is often overlooked, and that is advancements in other areas of medicine and medical technology. In 1912, there were 6,000 deaths per year due to the measles virus, and in 1962, the year before the vaccine, that number had been cut down to just over 400 per year. When we look at media coverage of measles outbreaks today, it seems to feed on fear and create hysteria. It also creates fear and animosity towards the unvaccinated. It's interesting when you compare that in 1962 there were an estimated 3 to 4 million incidences of measles and an average of 432 deaths per year. Today, we have anywhere from 55 cases to maybe a rash of outbreaks resulting in maybe 1,000 cases of measles. According to the CDC, there has not been a death from measles or even a case of encephalitis since 2015. Some people are afraid of contracting measles or dying from measles. Some people are afraid of industry bias or corruption or potential harms from the measles vaccine itself. All these concerns seem valid, rooted in science, and should not be off the table for conversation. Whatever side of the argument you find yourself on, there is legitimacy to your argument. Just remember, there's legitimacy to other people's arguments as well. When you look at the fact that only 3 to 4 people die each year from tetanus, and that there hasn't been a measles death since 2015, it kind of makes you wonder, is this fear-mongering? Is it a distraction from the questions we should be asking? What is this conversation really about? When we look at some 2016-2017 data, we see that over 1 million people die from heart disease and cancer each year. There are over 88,000 alcohol-related deaths each year, 70,000 drug overdose deaths, 45,000 suicides, 19,000 homicides. 3,000 plus U.S. children were victims of sex trafficking, and 1,750 children died from abuse and neglect. On top of all that, tobacco remains the single largest preventable cause of death and disease in the United States. Cigarette smoking kills more than 480,000 Americans each year. I point these numbers out for you to consider the next time you hear about the latest measles outbreak, when there hasn't been one death or one case of encephalitis in 4 years, or when people debate a child going to school without having had the tetanus vaccine, even though tetanus is non-communicable. Using the term anti-vaxxer creates shame and stigma, lacks compassion and understanding, stunts productive conversations, silences valid questions and concerns, promotes a do-what-you're-told culture, and discourages being an informed consumer or your own health advocate. Opposition against vaccines is nothing new. People have questioned safety and efficacy since their inception. This stems largely from a historic lack of transparency, trust, and at times integrity by government agencies and the pharmaceutical industry. In addition, there are and always have been legitimate safety concerns related to vaccine administration. The vaccine debate is every bit as much about these issues as it is about humanity's struggle against disease. Calling someone an anti-vaxxer does nothing to advance or address any of these problems or concerns. In fact, it's more likely to do the opposite. Terms like anti-vaxxer are bigoted and often used with disdain. They reduce complex issues to make them appear black and white, pro or anti, you're with us or you're against us. The result is a silencing of legitimate questions and concerns from anyone that finds themselves somewhere in between for fear for being ridiculed or dismissed. In order for people to have faith in vaccines and their efficacy, people need to have faith in those institutions that develop, test, create policy for, and administer vaccines. Terms used to mock, shame, humiliate, and stigmatize those with opposing viewpoints lack empathy, oversimplify complex issues, and certainly do not create faith in our nation's institutions.